Thank you, Paul.
Thank you. Right, so share my content. Right, can everybody see that? Not yet.
Yeah, I can see it.
Great stuff. If I just switch my camera off then as well, that'll turn the camera off, won't it? Go back.
Yep, you've gone.
Okay, well, I'll start. I'll start from here then. Okay, hello everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Paul Sheriff. I'm a chartered engineer and a fellow of the Institution of Mechanical Engineers. And people on the call will know me. That I've been working on Coleman sites locally for well over 25 years. I've worked in management roles leading mechanical integrity, maintenance, projects, reliability and improvement departments in both the steel industry and the chemical industry. I'm API 580 certified, and I've been implementing risk-based inspection programs since 2012. For the past 2 years, I've been working for asset optimization consultants. Just got the one slide really on asset optimization consultants, just to give people an idea of just who we are. So I'd like to spend a couple of minutes just introducing the consultants to those of you who aren't aware of the company. Moving on. Right. We're a team of consultants with a wealth of experience and shared values, and the company was founded in 2012, but our consultants have worked together for over 20 years, and we've amassed hundreds of years of combined experience. We now share our wisdom and experience to deliver sustainable asset integrity management programs. Delivered hundreds of successful and sustainable RBI software and implementation projects. We also contributed to the first RBI resource document, which is now known as API 581, and we continue to contribute to this and other industry codes and guidance. Our team has worked in a variety of industry sectors, and we're a mix of consultants and ex-user owner professionals, and this mix enables us to fully understand and deliver asset integrity programs that our clients can sustain. We've got offices in Houston in the US and here in the UK at Catch. And from here at Catch, we're well placed to deliver on a global scale. We've got clients in Europe, the Middle East, South America, and Australia as well. That's the commercial done. Over the next 20 minutes, I'd like to cover two specific topics. Firstly, I'd like to share with you some valuable lessons that we've learned as a company when implementing risk-based inspection projects during the last 20 years. Secondly, coming more up to date, I'd like to share with you some of the lessons that we've learned as a company during the last 7 months when it comes to working with COVID-19. In particular, the lessons that we've learned when it comes to implementing risk-based inspection projects and delivering software training and API 580 training remotely.
Paul, you're on camera. Do you want to stay on camera?
How's that?
There you go.
Thank you. So during the implementation of risk-based inspection projects over the last 20 years, we've learned a few valuable lessons which we have incorporated into our project implementation approach, and for us has become business as usual. Some of the more common issues that we've seen and addressed during the implementation process are as follows. So for a start, training and how and when the training is presented during a project. Secondly, a pilot project and how you should choose the best type of unit for a pilot project. And I intend to cover these first two subjects in more detail in the next 2 slides. Thirdly, acceptable risk, and this is about making sure that this topic is fully addressed and determined during the project. Determining what is acceptable risk for a company is an important part of the RBI process. We find that some companies are reluctant to address this issue. Senior managers do not always have experience of what is meant by acceptable risk, and they're usually happy to leave matters of mechanical integrity to the inspection department, not realizing that, like other areas of asset management, the strategy needs to be formulated and led from the top. There are also fears for them around litigation. In the UK, the issue of acceptable risk is made more complex as the HSE regulator has a goal-setting attitude to safety standards and is always looking for a company to continue to improve and reduce risk to a LARP, or as low as is reasonably practicable as well. And we found that one way through this process is to facilitate a meeting of the site management team in order to determine acceptable risk targets and levels. Fourthly, ensuring plant ownership. This issue is important to ensure that the implementation process is sustained and sustainable once we've left the site. It's very rare these days that organisations have persons who are underutilised in their inspection team. And during a risk-based inspection implementation project, it's really tempting to use contractors to execute the implementation work and leave the original busy inspection team executing their more normal duties. However, this approach does not help to sustain the programme. And we believe that a better approach, when contractors are inevitably required, is to use the contractors to execute the more day-to-day duties of the inspection team. This enables one or two key company inspectors or engineers to be involved in the project implementation. And using this approach, you then get commitment and ownership from the start of the project, and it means that the project is sustained once we've left the site. Finally, on the point of data, don't underestimate the amount of data and the time that it's needed to collect the data for an implementation project. Unless you're very lucky, collecting data on site will be a process that requires real tenacity and patience. The data is very rarely found in one place or one source. It's extremely important that the data collected is validated to check that it's accurate and reliable. And the validation of the data, like many processes in an RBI implementation project, needs a team approach. And the team approach will inevitably mean the assistance of people on operations and maintenance, because you'll need them to collect the data that's been collected. And these personnel, they won't initially see themselves as stakeholders in this type of project, and they may well need some persuading or even educating to demonstrate their importance to the project. I've found that biscuits at the meeting help too to get them there. The methodology of the RBI approach taken will inevitably have a large influence on the type and the amount of data that will need to be collected. And it goes without saying that the accuracy of the data will have a large influence on the calculation of consequence of failure and probability of failure. These days, software packages make the calculation of COF and POF, consequence of failure and probability of failure, and then risk a very quick process, but only once you've collected all of the relevant data. So moving on then to training lessons, one of the more common faults seen during an RBI implementation is to try to complete all of the training that's required in one session right at the start of the implementation project. The issue with this approach means that it can sometimes be months, potentially 6 months or more from the start of the project until the full implementation is completed, and the team will have forgotten the training and the steps required. This approach could be seen as efficient for myself and my colleague Paul as a consultant, as it completes the training in one hit, but it's not effective for the client's personnel who are being trained. Our own company objective is to ensure that the RBI implementation project is a success by being flexible with the project plan and the training plan. And it will only be a success if the client company are able to continue the process once we've left the client's site. It's important that any training given is accompanied with a reference manual, and it's followed up with a chance for the student to use his or her skills to build up the memory muscle required to complete the tasks, either whilst the consultant is still on site to advise and coach, or available through Teams, for instance. As an example, at the beginning of the project, it will be usual to introduce the concept of risk and to walk the project team through the various steps in a project implementation plan, from collecting and validating data right through to mitigation and reassessment. It's likely that circuitization will be a new subject to the team, and they'll need to be trained so that piping lines can be arranged into corrosion circuits. Field verification and validation training will be needed for the team to ensure that the data and information collected is current and accurate. And this is important for the reasons discussed on the last slide, that we talked about, making sure that you've got some valid data. Similarly, training to determine historical inspection task confidence will be required in the information collection part of the project. It's very important that the client understands how consequence of failure and probability of failure are being calculated. And there are two main reasons for this. Here in the UK, we've had discussions with the HSE regulator before, and they're very critical of companies not understanding the COF and the POF models that are being used, or being able to explain how these values are being calculated. They refer to it as black box technology. But more importantly, the more you understand the consequence of failure and probability of failure models that are being used, the easier it becomes to understand just which factors are driving the risk in your plant. So when risk has been calculated, it becomes easy to understand or recommend mitigation actions that will reduce risk. And then finally, our training would conclude with training to be able to calculate risk effectively and consistently, and to choose an effective inspection strategy for the next inspection task. When it comes to a pilot project, then the majority of projects obviously start with a pilot project. The pilot project gives the site management a chance to understand the costs and the time that will be required in full implementation. It's also a chance to fully understand the typical benefits and step change that can be produced by a full implementation project. A risk-based inspection implementation project is usually looking to demonstrate benefits like improving the management and compliance of health and safety on site, to effectively identify and repair deteriorating equipment, and to produce cost savings. We found that the power of the risk-based approach can be more effectively demonstrated as producing these kinds of benefits by picking a trial production unit with a range of pressure equipment, a range of process fluids, and a range of materials of construction. The option is to choose the unit which is assumed to have the greatest consequence of failure risk, or to choose to calculate risk for the equipment which has already been acknowledged as bad acting. In these circumstances, it's highly likely that the project will deliver a result which is very narrow. The result will also be unsurprising, and it's unlikely to show any real changes in the original inspection periodicities or the inspection strategies required, unless, of course, the previous inspection strategies weren't looking for the correct damage mechanisms, or the original inspection tasks weren't effective enough at finding the required damage mechanisms. Choosing a unit with a wide range of possibilities is more likely to produce a diverse set of risk values, and this in turn will require a more diverse set of inspection tasks to be executed at a more diverse frequency. Potentially, it could be putting a spotlight on an area that's less used to scrutiny, and that in itself may throw up more factors that can be changed or need changing. The greater the change that's seen during this process, then the greater the change can be demonstrated in the health and safety compliance, in identifying your deteriorating equipment, and also in cost reductions. And as a consequence, the site management will be more confident that a full implementation will produce a significant change in site efficiency, which is what you'll be looking for. Moving on then to lessons we've learned during the COVID pandemic. Well, the whole world changed in March. Many of us who had never contemplated working from home before, we were faced with the prospect of having to work from home and work remotely. I think most of us found that with a bit of flexibility and the use of Zoom, Microsoft Teams and WebEx, lots of things we'd never even heard of before, it was possible to work effectively and efficiently from home, and not nearly as difficult as we first thought. My wife, for instance, she's even been able to continue a Pilates class on a weekly basis over Zoom. Whilst there may be some good reasons for returning to the office, I think it'll make it easier to mentor and coach new staff, or to be better able to share company values. Most organisations seem to have adapted and are getting used to working this way. Many companies have started to measure the ways that the pandemic has improved their business, and I believe that the pandemic has made working remotely something that's here to stay for at least 3 good reasons. Firstly, companies have realised that it's as easy for their staff to work from home as it is to work in the office. With the cost of office bills for rent, rates and utilities all being saved, there are genuine cost savings to be made by companies that their people continue to work from home. Secondly, people have shown that it can be as effective and in some cases even more productive when working from home. So there's not the loss in productivity that was anticipated. The software packages that I've mentioned, Zoom, Microsoft Teams and WebEx, they've all shown how easy it is to keep in touch with people anywhere at any time. And thirdly, there seem to be some good advantages for employees as well. And I know many are not missing the many hours of the week that are wasted by their daily commute, or the cost even of getting to and from the office either. Like other consultancies, we've assisted our clients to use the power of RBI to evergreen their risk-based inspection plans. And in particular, we've noticed that companies have been put under a particular pressure this year to save money by postponing turnarounds or maintenance projects. The use of RBI has given them a way of checking and justifying that their shutdown plans can be safely changed and postponed without increasing risk. There's several ways that we've had to change how we function as a company by being more flexible in our approach during the pandemic. Firstly, when it comes to project implementation, we found ourselves unable to gain access to our clients' sites, and access has been restricted on many sites to restrict the spread of COVID-19. We were therefore unable to get the usual access to the documents and information that, as I've mentioned before, it's really important as part of the data and information collection process. So in order to progress one of our implementation projects during the lockdown, the following approaches were taken. Firstly, a 3 terabyte hard drive was used to download information that we'd requested from site. It was then physically handed over to us to enable us to work remotely. And some points to be aware of with this type of approach are as follows. Firstly, can all the data be accessed electronically, or is some of the data actually just paper-based? Is any of the information proprietary equipment where the data is not able to leave site for reasons of confidentiality? And then questions really around how fast are your computer networks? Downloaded information can be relatively quick, but we've noticed that uploading information is much slower. And if the uploading speed is much slower, in the case that I'm referring to, it took us 3 days to upload the information. What's your project team going to do whilst you wait for this information to be uploaded? Have you got some other tasks or other projects that they can progress instead of being stopped? And secondly, there'll inevitably be queries that need to be followed up on once the information is interrogated or validated. And we've noticed the points that we picked up really with this approach are as follows. Firstly, you really need a client engineer or inspector available as a go-to person to be able to progress these types of inquiries quickly. Luckily, in our case, we were assigned one of them being more experienced site inspectors for this role. You then need a way of progressing inquiry messages. So you need to be able to make sure that you can log messages and progress them quickly. And in this last case, it was found that the easiest way to do this, to progress queries and validation questions, was to add a member of our team as a guest member to the client's Microsoft Team database. And then obviously both client and consultant need to be aware and to monitor their Microsoft Teams accounts to ensure that inquiry messages and answers are not missed. Despite the pandemic, we've continued to train personnel to be ready for their API 580 examination in August. And also we've trained people in basic and advanced user software training. The use of software has been very important in the training delivery process for obvious reasons. And we've compared Zoom, Teams and WebEx. And here are some of the advantages and disadvantages that we've become aware of by using the software. Firstly, with Zoom, one of the big advantages is that the host can mute everyone and the taking of questions can be really well controlled. But the disadvantage is it's not so easy to share your screen and share presentations. With Teams, you've got similar advantages to Zoom, but it is easier to share screens. But one of the disadvantages we've noticed is that you can still use Teams if you're a Skype user, but then you get into difficulties when you try to share your screen as a Skype user. And then with WebEx, one of the advantages, it's a really good system that most organizations have access to. The disadvantage is that some systems are just restricted to just 25 users, including the host. And for this reason, one session that we were trying to run, that had to be moved from WebEx to Teams instead, so we could progress the training. The most important thing we found, though, is during the training, a kick-off meeting held a few days before the training is scheduled to discuss the new training approach. That's invaluable. And the items discussed during this kick-off meeting, I'll talk more about them in more detail on the next slide. But inevitably, there are a number of practical changes that are required to deliver training remotely. Firstly, issues for the presenter. For the presenter, he's got no real way of seeing his students' faces. That makes it difficult to have some rapport with his audience. It's a bit like today's webinar, really. For this reason, it's important that the number of people being trained is reduced to a smaller number. and this becomes even more important if the training being delivered is interactive. Obviously, one-to-one tuition is best, but our tutors have found that they can cope with training up to 4 people. To check that some rapport is there, the presenter found he needed to ask direct questions to each student to check that the pace of the training was right and that all of the topics were being understood. So it was made clear during the kick-off meeting that this approach was going to be taken, so it was not a surprise when the student was asked a question. From the student's point of view, it was recognised it's more difficult to concentrate when completing training remotely and over a computer monitor. If the training was usually half a day, then a full day was allowed instead. The sessions were delivered in 45-minute chunks with a 15-minute break between sessions, and a full hour was allowed for lunch too. The breaks were a good time for the presenter to check with the students separately that the topics were being understood fully. A couple of other ground rules that have been established so that everyone being trained will be muted, and then questions will be taken at the end of each 45-minute session. The different software, as I said before, has ways in which you can flag up to the presenter you've got a question to ask, and these functions are particularly useful. So moving on to the kick-off meeting. As I mentioned before on the last slide, a kick-off meeting to discuss the training process and the rules of engagement in more detail has been found to be critical. Firstly, this meeting is a chance to test the software that's potentially going to be used for the training, and it's also a chance for any software changes to be discussed or made, particularly if there are any issues during this meeting. Training materials, they'll have already been sent out to the audience, and this meeting is a chance too for the students to ask any questions that are presenting themselves now they've been made themselves familiar with the training subject. Specific questions could also be emailed to the presenter, and as long as the presenter is given enough time, and I would have thought 24 hours should be enough notice, he should then be able to address these questions during the training. On a similar theme, at the same time, the presenter will ask each student their expectations of the training course, and again, this is a chance for the presenter to tailor his training for any particular expectations. The rules around the asking of questions, that's outlined during this meeting, as is the reason for the students being muted. And in one case, one of our presenters demonstrated just how loud the background noise would be if the other students weren't muted, which demonstrated clearly why we needed to take this approach. During this initial meeting, the timings will be discussed in more detail. And as mentioned before, the reasons for shorter training periods and greater breaks will be discussed, and becomes even more important during remote training that students are ready to start on time. During this kick-off meeting, it will be explained that the training session will be opened and available for the students to join the training 15 minutes before the official starting time. As has been stated on the last slide, creating a rapport is particularly difficult. It will be explained that the questions will be asked of individual students throughout the training sessions to check the understanding of the topic and to check that the pace of the presentation is good. That's made clear to the students to ensure that they're not surprised and that they're prepared when they're asked questions by the presenter. Our presenter found it easy to keep his students interested and to improve levels of concentration by asking the students particular examples of equipment to cover during hands-on training. And this meant that students were being trained on equipment that was familiar to them, and it also enabled them to pick bad acting equipment, for instance, so that reliability issues could be addressed as part of the training as well. Finally, a copy of all the questions raised during the training and the answers given was noted, and then that was emailed out to all of the students, and an individual follow-up session was lined up so that any problems or issues encountered after the training could then be addressed. So in summary, during this presentation, we've examined 2 topics. Firstly, please be aware of common mistakes that can be made during a project implementation. We found it best to train throughout a project and just before the skills are required. Ensure that you pick the best unit for a pilot study. Make sure that you determine acceptable risk. Execute the staff execute the staff, that's not a good idea. Execute the project using company staff to ensure its sustainability. And don't underestimate the amount of data required for a project. Secondly, COVID-19 has permanently changed the way that we work, probably forever. But project execution is still possible with a flexible approach, and training is still possible with the implementation and agreement of some really good ground rules. And then the last thing to say is, obviously if you need any more information or you need any help with your asset integrity program, please take a look at our website. We've also got a YouTube channel these days that we're putting video logs out on, or send us an email and we'll be happy to help. And that concludes my presentation this morning.
Thank you, Paul.
Do I have to do something like unshare or something like that?
Yeah, probably best, yeah. Does anybody have any questions? And we're now joined by the other Paul, sliding into the background there. So does anybody have any questions for the two Pauls?
No, thanks.
If you do, please come off mute. Show yourselves. I've got a question regarding data. Does everybody always have the correct data that you need? How much data is required to implement one of these projects?
It's very rare that you find all the data in one place quite conveniently there. And it's very often that you've got to do some mining, shine the light in people's eyes, or even then go and look at your local PI systems and your local data systems to find out a little bit more information. Sometimes it's worth actually going on site, do some site verification, looking at pressure vessels and their identification actually on site itself. And I think, to go back to the other question you asked about how much data do you actually need, well, it does depend on the approach you take. And I think if you're taking a more qualitative approach, you probably need to collect less data, but then you're obviously relying more on people's opinion and people's expertise to come to the right decision. You want to say something?
Yeah, so it's quite often that we find the site won't have all the data required for a more advanced model. So at that point, what we can do is make some assumptions. We try to keep those conservative, and we always validate those assumptions with the technical experts on the plant to make sure that they're reasonable. Sometimes we do that for expediency to work through the project. If we've got to go out to, for example, OEMs, original equipment manufacturers, to get further data about certain parts of a compressor or a pump or something of that nature that's not well detailed, check for materials of construction or its design pressure capability or something of that nature. So yeah, sometimes we have to make assumptions. One thing we find as well is, because there are multiple data sources, for example, field verification on site, looking at data plates, design drawings, SAP or CMMS data, HAZOPs or heat mass balances, all these kind of different things, as well as the data that comes from people, so from maintenance teams, from guys who are involved in management of change, all that kind of non-written data. We find that we have discrepancies between that data, and we have to then go and hunt down and find out what is the truth. And that sometimes takes us a bit of time to make sure that data is then accurate. That can be very important if we're looking at maybe a highly corrosive process fluid or process, and there is a doubt about the materials of construction used or its capabilities for corrosion resistance. So we need to get that right.
Yep. Thank you. Yeah, brilliant. We've got a question that's come in. How do you manage dead legs?
How do you manage dead legs? There are a number of different ways to manage dead legs. You could create them as a separate RBI component. So when we deliver an RBI program, we break down parts of particular pieces of equipment into components, and you could separate them out as a separate component within a piece of equipment, because they are more susceptible to internal corrosion, depending on the nature of the dead leg, whether or not it's also a cold finger, whether or not it's going to gather more corrosive material, concentrate corrosive materials. So that's one way of doing that. Another way is to take the worst case corrosion scenario for that pipe work and flag it as a dead leg. And then I'm talking kind of smaller dead legs rather than a processed dead leg where maybe there's an alternative route for a piping route and it's being isolated. Some of the smaller dead legs, if we take the worst case scenario and make sure that we include in the inspection planning part that there are dead legs in this system, and there should be a particular attention by the inspector to look at those dead legs and to make sure that when we determine where our corrosion monitoring locations should be, that we pick areas of susceptibility like dead legs. So that's two different ways we would do that.
Right, okay. There's been a further comment that says, what if you have thousands of dead legs?
Yeah, that becomes more difficult. So probably the secondary approach in terms of thousands of dead legs, we would include them in the piping system and be very conservative with the corrosion rates and make sure that that system was flagged to say there are dead legs in that system. We see a lot of this with drains, vents, small branches that are isolated, those kind of things. Yeah, one piping circuit could have multiple small dead legs on there, so we would flag that piece of equipment as having dead legs and use the corrosion rates related to the dead legs to drive the risk analysis and to the inspection periodicity, and also make sure that written scheme contains comments about the susceptibility of corrosion at dead legs and focuses the inspector's attention to make sure that those are managed correctly.
Okay. Oops, hold on, I just pressed the wrong button. Melissa's got a question. Do you do different RBIs on safety critical redundant assets to that of live assets?
Safety critical redundant assets. So from that, I'm deducting that you have equipment that's out of service, that's maybe isolated, but is from a structural point of view, could cause injury, cause harm to people should there be a structural failure. Yes, you can do that. You would typically do that probably with a qualitative approach, because RBI is certainly with a quantitative approach is based upon operating conditions. But you could certainly use a qualitative approach and consider, the external degradation to structural components, and develop a written scheme of examination that caters for out-of-service equipment.
Is that okay, Melissa? She's typing. If you want to come in off mute, brilliant. Oh, there you go. You're brilliant, guys.
As I came past Brig Road the other day, I noticed that the heavy section mill has been demolished. So I guess that in some cases, Melissa, you're getting on with that as well.
Yeah, if you want to come off mute, Melissa, you can.
Yep, we are. It's easier to speak than type. We're getting there. Obviously, we've still got a lot of assets around the plant which are redundant and still have residual liquids in there. So it was just more of a question from the point of view of how you guys would go about it, to how we do it currently if we're missing a trick more than anything.
So that, Melissa, that extends to equipment that's potentially isolated in plant but isn't redundant. Something that's perhaps a rotable asset, or you'll have duty spare kind of situation where you might isolate and depressurize a piece of equipment. It's still categorized, I guess, as in-service inspection. It's still there, it's still in the plant. It's not pressurized, but it still has a hazard associated with that. And at that point, you can then design your written scheme of examination and your RBI to cater for the fact that it's potentially the damage mechanisms are different, the temperatures are lower. Maybe there's you're not getting into or it'll be well below a CUI range or a stress corrosion cracking temperature. But you can certainly have a kind of a secondary scheme that will cater for the management of that piece of equipment whilst it's out of service. This is something that I personally have an experience with the HSE looking for when you have equipment that's still got some level of hazardous substance contained, but is not in let's say active operation. You can manage it in an out of service condition. Any more questions?
Rachel's got her hand up.
Okay, Rachel.
Yeah, I've got a question about communication. So obviously you talked about the importance of acceptable risk being driven from the top. Presumably the senior guys have got really involved in commissioning the pilot, and then everybody sits down and has a really detailed discussion and you identify some risks. How do you communicate that really detailed technical discussion and the risks so that senior guys understand the hazards they're managing and the risks they're managing, but not kind of get their knickers in a knot, if you know what I mean?
Yeah, great. So what we've done in the past is we've delivered some RBI training aimed at management level and at senior professional level, so that everybody gets kind of the same message and gets the same understanding of what is meant by acceptable risk, and also what the differences are with RBI versus PHA and other risk management methodologies, so that we start on a level playing field, and that these kind of more highly technical discussions can take place around, you know, what is the acceptable level of risk in terms of injury risk versus a equipment damage risk or a financial risk, for example. Some of the more quantitative methodologies have separate risk targets depending on what kind of consequence category you're considering. So these can be tailored. For example, you know, you can put a much lesser emphasis on financial risk versus a health and safety injury risk, which we see quite a bit. You know, people are generally more interested in what the health and safety major accident kind of hazard implications are of their hazardous equipment that are included in the RBI study than they are with production loss and downtime, and probably rightly so.
Yeah, Paul makes a good point there. There's a lot of different risks here with PHA, HAZOPs, and obviously then we kind of muddy the waters ourselves with RBI. What RBI is obviously doing is looking at what is relative risk, whereas the other situations really are looking at sort of absolute. And one of the things that you obviously need to get over during this discussion is just kind of what the difference is and why we are calculating risk as a prioritization tool, rather than getting down to the absolute figures. Going back to when the other part of your question was about communication, and it's very then easy to communicate risk using risk matrices. And I think risk matrices are quite then common, and people understand those who have been involved in PHAs or have been involved in management of change for the facility, meetings and things like that. So that's how we would communicate it. But as Paul said, he's dead right. There's quite a bit of education there to do, and we've even done 580 training on site for people to make sure that they understand the just what they're getting into. Sorry, 580 training. People know what 580 training is, I think, don't they? API 580. Hopefully they do.
Yeah, Rachel, are you all right? You still got your hand up, or?
Oh, sorry, I just didn't realise how to take it down. Now I have. No, that's great. I mean, I'd love to know your tips for getting really senior guys into a room to talk technical, because my experience is they don't have very long attention spans when it comes to that sort of thing, and they just want to be told everything's okay.
Yeah, we've had them in there for 2 days straight, so we've managed to do that, and it's all part of the management of change process. and we've had to in the past just break it up into smaller sessions, not trying to get the entire senior leadership team of a company in the room all at once together in one go, because that's seldom happens. So we have to break these down into shorter sessions, multiple sessions with smaller groups, and try and make that group as diverse as possible in terms of the disciplines that are in that group, and getting the senior engineers, mechanical guys, electrical guys. There's similarities here with SIL and LOPA and all those kind of things. The more people you educate and communicate with, the better understanding is of the process, and the better discussions there are in the future when you talk about what the risk of the mechanical integrity related problems there are on site. When people understand how you've got to that process and that you've followed a systematic, industry standard, world recognized process to get there, it's very important, that communication process.
Yeah, right, John. This is another change process, isn't it? We're talking about here. Nobody likes change. This could be a 2 or 3 year change process that a company goes through when they implement RBI. And as any change process, you've got to keep talking, haven't you? Talking and coaxing people along. We have got what I would add to that is we've got a methodology to make it clear how to calculate bands of acceptable risk within the matrix, and maybe that uses some obvious parameters and matrix and information that senior management will be aware of, and that in itself will help them with the process as well. Just think about stuff that Mike's sent us just recently. So we could probably share that with you, if you want to see some of that.
One of the other interesting conversations we have around risk-based inspection and risk mitigation, it's always about, and I see some of the names on the attendees on this session, and I know you guys are mechanical integrity and inspection related, some of you, and this is something you'll have dealt with in the past, is how much risk mitigation do we get from repeat inspection? We know that inspection itself gives us more data. It checks to say that we are following a certain path in terms of deterioration, that there isn't additional damage, there aren't other damage mechanisms to consider, and that our assumptions that we made or our operating parameters still remain the same as the original assessment as we go into a risk reassessment. But as with all the inspection processes, whether risk-based inspection or time-based, time and condition-based, the risk isn't sufficiently mitigated by going out and doing an inspection if we don't act upon the results. So we can go and look at something as often as possible, as often as you like, daily, weekly, monthly, yearly. If the inspection team find defects and re-risk assess based upon the defects they've found, the mitigation process really is fixing those problems. We can perform fitness for service assessment to readjust the levels of acceptance criteria, but at the end of the day, if the equipment's getting thinner, then looking at it several times and measuring it with all the best tools we have in our toolbox will not prevent it from failing. Dealing with the risk by mitigating through maintenance, through design change, through consequence reduction, really is the key to mitigating that risk. It's something that we have to repeat quite often when dealing with certainly with people who may be higher up in the organisation, management level, those kind of things. The risk-based inspection does not mean that your equipment won't fail. It's a systematic approach to managing your inspection, but risk mitigation, real risk mitigation, really comes from acting upon the results of your inspection.
All right, Paul. And Paul, if there's no further questions, then I think I'll wrap this session up today. Thank you to Paul and Paul for their presentation today. Just something's just popped up. Oh, great point. Rachel says great point.
It was spoken from the heart. I could tell that.
Please answer the feedback questionnaire that I will be sending out this afternoon. If you've got any further questions for Paul and Paul, get in touch with myself and then I can marry you up. As I said, there's 30 minutes of free consultation, so please take advantage of that. And hopefully we'll see you all again in the near future. So thank you for attending today, and thank you to Paul and Paul for presenting a fascinating webinar.
Pleasure.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.